Hey, greetings everyone. I'm very happy to be here at DataFest. It's one of my favorite conferences in the annual schedule of conferences that I do get to attend, and I've actually been at every single one in one form or another, so I'm very happy this year to be a speaker. And so today I'm going to try and tell you a bit about how over the last few months I've been trying to measure and discourage vote buying in Georgia. And in doing so, I have to make one brief comment. So anything that I say, don't get upset with the National Endowment of Democracy, which has generously funded this research. And secondly, nothing that I say reflects their point of view or my employer's point of view. So if you get upset on Twitter, at me, not them. So yeah. The other thing that I wanted to say with being at DataFest is I've been at, not every single presentation, but every year. And something that I've always felt was lacking is sort of an appreciation of surveys, which I do lots of surveys, and so I think that that sort of comes out. And those of you who know me hear me complain about surveys, as opposed to artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so the inspiration for this talk is less about vote buying and discouraging it, and more about showing you that this traditional survey tool, this traditional data tool, actually really has a great deal of potential inside of it and really lets us do lots of interesting things that we might not be able to do with other approaches. So to try and inspire some of you to get into surveys, today I'm going to be talking a bit about the problem of electoral malfeasance in Georgia and how it's developed in recent years. Afterwards, I'm going to get into trying to measure behavior that people don't want to tell you about, especially in the context of a survey, which sounds right, or sounds weird, right? And from there, I'll discuss how I've been attempting to discourage people from selling their votes in Georgia over the last few months. And so, just to start out, Georgia's elections in recent years, so 2018, 2020, 2021, they've been getting progressively worse. This is something that shows up when we look at the international assessments of Georgia's elections, and particularly when we look at things like the Freedom House scores for electoral integrity, other democracy projects. Georgia's scores keep getting lower as time goes by and as elections go by. And this has been something that we've been seeing more and more. This is a quote. It's from the OSCE's ODIHR's Preliminary Findings and Conclusions report for this year's October 2nd elections. And you can see there that it says that allegations of vote buying marred the quality of the election. And these allegations were consistent and widespread. So this is something of a statement coming from OSCE ODIHR, first because they're the most authoritative body internationally when it comes to election monitoring and assessment of the quality of elections. The second reason is it's also a diplomatic organization. Here they're not mincing words. They're saying there's consistent and widespread allegations, which is something that you don't normally see inside of these assessments. Usually they would go on the 10th page somewhere saying, we think that there might have been a problem. This was the second sentence inside of that report. So this is sort of the context we're in. But the other thing that I want to call your attention to is that they use the word allegations, right? And the reason why is it's extremely difficult to show evidence of vote buying. When we do get evidence of vote buying, we usually end up with something like this. So what this piece of paper is it's a heavily blurred piece of paper because of the information contained on it. So I didn't want to divulge people's personal information, but this image is readily searchable on the internet. And what's on this piece of paper is people's names, people's personal identification number tied to their ID, and people's telephone numbers. So this is what we generally see as evidence. The one number that I haven't blurred out here is this 50, this 150, this 200 over here. And with that, that's supposedly, and I would say supposedly evidence of the amount of money given to people in different circumstances to vote in a specific way. So this is one form of evidence that we often see when it comes to vote buying allegations in Georgia. So could we turn on the video for the next one? So we're gonna have just two quick clips that are gonna pop up in just 1 minute here. And what they'll show is the other type of evidence that we often see of vote buying in Georgia. And so these tend to be films of people exchanging money outside of polling places. And so when people are exchanging money outside of polling places, there's election monitors there, there's political party operatives there, filming this sometimes, and sometimes they catch people in what appears to be vote buying. So let's go with this first video if it's ready.
ფული ხელში უკავია? ახლოდან წავიდა. არ დაგინახავს. ფული ხელში უკავია? ახლოდან წავიდა. ჩამოწია, არ დაგინახავს. ახლოდან მიყავდია. ჩამოწია, ცოტა ხანი ჩამოწია, არ დაგინახავს სამქალ, მაგრამ ჩამოწია გვიყურე. ფული ხელში უკავია?
So you can see a 100 lari note there in the woman's hand. And this is something that we've seen more and more videos of in recent years, dating even back to 2016, if I'm not mistaken. So while the next video is loading, I would say two important things about this video. First, so it's supposedly outside of a polling station, but this video was on the Twitter account of an opposition party. And it's supposedly someone who supports them, or it's actually opposition-related media showing this, right? So if you're a Georgian Dream supporter and don't want to believe this, you all of a sudden have lots of reasons. Well, oh, it's just the opposition media. Maybe they staged it. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe this, maybe that, to try and deflect this, right? So this next video that's coming up, it's another example. So it's outside of a polling station in Insani and Tbilisi. And this comes from a more credible source, a more neutral source, so ISFED, so they're the main elections watchdog in Georgia. And they're saying that this appears to be another example of vote buying in Georgia. And so when we come to evidence, though, when we really want to know whether or not someone sold their vote, it's sort of hard, right? Because if I come to your house and I say, hey, do you sell your vote? Especially if I'm a survey person, right? Because I'm talking about survey measurement today. And some random stranger calls you on the phone and says, hi, I'm calling from an NGO and I was just wondering if you do drugs. Or I was wondering if you've given anyone a bribe recently. Or in the current case, so have you sold your vote recently? And so just generally, we don't get super smoking guns. We don't get financial transactions that show, okay, there's 20,000 laris transferred to X, Y, and Z for vote buying, right? So it's hard to get those smoking guns. And this evidence that I've shown before is the type of evidence that we generally get when it comes to vote buying internationally as well as in Georgia. So what am I trying to do? And to actually approach measuring vote buying in Georgia, and then actually also discourage it. I'm doing three things, or I did three things. I first did a list experiment, and I'll explain what that is in just a minute. It's a little bit of a crazy idea, but it works. And then we did pre-electoral survey experiments, testing different messages which could discourage people from selling their vote, and see which ones most effectively do so. And afterwards, we ran a cluster randomized control trial in Tbilisi, which is sort of like a medical trial, but we randomly distributed messages in the city and then measured their efficacy. So, what's a list experiment? A list experiment is like a randomized control trial, like a controlled experiment in other contexts like medicine, but the treatment is actually one extra item on a list. So we go to someone's house and we say, please take a look at this list of things, and please tell me how many you're going to do in the next 6 months, or how many you've done in the last month. Don't tell me which ones you did by any means. I don't want to know. Just tell me a number from 0 to 3. And so 0 to 3 in the current context was the control condition. So people saw or were read a list that says, go to a political rally, go outside without a mask, vote in elections. The second list that we showed people in the treatment group was the same exact list, They read the same exact question, but the key difference was that we asked people, and we had on the list, I will vote for a certain candidate in exchange for money or some other benefit. And so with this, what we did, and by comparing the means, so the average number in the control group to the treatment group, and then subtracting them, we actually get the share of the population who intends on selling their vote in the upcoming election. This survey, and this version of this list experiment, we did prior to the election, so in August, September of this year. Next, because we're trying not only to measure, so that's the previous slide is basically how we're trying to measure how much election fraud there may have been. We hope that there's none, obviously, but we're also trying to discourage it. And so what we did at the same time on that survey is we used 5 behaviorally and culturally informed messages to try and discourage people from selling their vote. And we afterwards conducted that list experiment to see which group who heard which message was least likely to actually be interested in selling their vote in the upcoming elections. And to do this, we used 5 different messages. The first was focused on international embarrassment, so Georgia looking bad internationally, but with positive examples. So in this message, we told people, before we ask you a few questions, we wanted to tell you about some recent international research on elections. And this research, according to Freedom House and other actors, so the OSCE, that Georgia's doing, so Armenia, North Macedonia, and Bolivia have seen improvements in the quality of their elections in recent years. In contrast, during the same period, Georgia's election quality has been declining. The second message that we tried out was still going for international embarrassment, but going with a negative message, actually. So positioning Georgia with countries that have been declining. As you can see here, the countries that we did this for were Kyrgyzstan, Ethiopia, and I'm committing the greatest sin by looking at the slide, and Venezuela. And by positioning Georgia together with these countries as countries experiencing declines in electoral quality or problems with their elections in recent years. So the next 3 messages that we tested were that it was a threat to Georgia's Western integration. I don't know how much everyone knows about public opinion in Georgia, but Georgians are overwhelmingly positive about integration with the EU and integration into NATO. And so we thought, well, if everybody really is genuinely committed to this, maybe if we point out the loss that's possible and the criticism that followed the quality of elections in 2020, maybe that'll work. Then we reminded people of the dark 90s. So for context, the 90s in Georgia are called the dark 90s because it was a very difficult time. And we connected this also, just reminded people that at this same time as there was a very difficult period happening, there was also a great deal of election fraud and a great deal of problems. The final message that we tested just pointed out how democratization is a problem, or one stumbling block towards democratization is that we actually have people who are willing to sell their vote. So this is the only result that anyone will see in this entire presentation because I can't release the data till January, but the message that worked best was the negative international embarrassment message. I can't say by how many percentage points, but this strongly discouraged people from intending to sell their vote moving forward. As you can see on the right-hand side, this is a visualization of that message that we developed based on that for distribution inside of a cluster randomized control trial, which we then conducted in Tbilisi. A cluster randomized control trial, you basically take a certain area and that group gets something and the other area, it doesn't. And so we took all of the lists of electoral precincts in Tbilisi. With the list, we took a representative sample, so taking random sample, probability proportional to size, and then we assigned one group to treatment randomly and one group to control randomly. And we blocked on district for all the data nerds and experiment nerds who may be watching. So with this, once we had the random assignment and before elections were conducted, we distributed 18,000 posters, 18,000 copies of this poster specifically, to the treatment clusters and left them on the doorsteps of 18,000 different households. In total, we guessed we probably had about 50,000 people see this poster in the pre-electoral period. After the elections, we then conducted a bit over 1,200 interviews, and moving forward, sometime in January, you'll be able to see the results. When it comes to the results, how we measured them, we again did a list experiment, with the key difference being that we switched out, do you intend to vote, or intend to sell your vote, or intend to trade your vote, for did you actually vote for a certain candidate in exchange for some benefit. Then we also, just because if there's an attitudinal environment where it's accepting of vote buying, then it's more likely to make it acceptable to actually sell your vote. And so what we did is we measured on a large number of outcomes what people's attitudes towards vote buying were specifically. And with this, we'll be able to see if whether that poster actually changed anyone's attitudes, changed anyone's behavior in terms of the elections, and potentially selling their votes, and potentially also show no vote buying or very limited vote buying, we would hope. But yeah, so that's what I have done recently in the last 3 months and spent the better part of the last 3-4 months doing, trying to measure and discourage vote buying in Georgia. And I can't tell you the results just yet, but follow us on Twitter. In January, they'll come out if you're really interested. And more importantly, just getting back to that original point inside of my talk, I hope that more people see the value in survey work and sort of get inspired by the flexibility of survey data, not just in the sense that we have the big data, we have AI, we have machine learning, which are all great. I use them myself sometimes, but surveys are really a cool tool too. So thank you so much for your attention. And with that, I'll give the floor for questions.
Hello, my name is Alexandra. I work for Forset, but I've also been involved in the observing missions of the elections for the past 5 years. So it really hits home, this topic. And thank you for the really interesting talk. We're looking forward to the results in January. What I would like to ask you about is the rural-urban split in this topic. I understand that you cannot share your results with us yet, but I'm interested if you've done any work on in that regard, because normally in rural areas, precincts in rural areas, they score much higher in terms of the votes for the government, and that was true during the previous government in Georgia as well, but it is also very true right now, except for Tsalenjiha, which is the only municipality where opposition won in the previous elections. And this could be probably due to like smaller communities where it is easier to impact the voters for those political coordinates, and also because the financial situation is worse for that. So I think in the experiments you've mentioned mainly Tbilisi. I'm wondering if you did some work in rural as well, rural areas, and if you did any comparisons between the two. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And yeah, I wish we had, but unfortunately we had the funding to run this thing, and we had to basically keep it in Tbilisi to keep finances under control. And the National Endowment of Democracy, I would say, was very generous with us in providing financing to make this all happen. And I really do appreciate them. They're one of my favorite donors out there for doing this kind of work, and they're interested in trying to find new ideas and trying to do new programming. We didn't do that. We would love to. I mean, with the next elections and presumably 2024, I would be quite happy to actually do that kind of thing, but actually doing it at the national level, but with a very, very large sample size. And that would cost quite a bit of money, but it would be a great deal of fun because, yes, anecdotally, that's exactly what we see, is greater problems in rural areas. So thank you for that question. Oh no, Nino, what are you going to ask me?
So you mentioned that there are things that you use AI and ML, and it's kind of effective, and sometimes these traditional methods are more like useful. And very often we also see that like in our partners as well, like there is this hype of using anything that has like AI in the name. Would you have some quick and brief advice to these organizations, like how can they quickly know what are the problems that can be tackled with using big tech, and where we should still employ the more like traditional old-fashioned methods, such as like simple surveys?
I first would say something that a mutual acquaintance of ours actually has said to me is, I think this goes more towards the general public, is I don't believe anyone and don't want to work for anyone that says AI. I'll only work for a machine learning firm. And that friend works in machine learning and does what most people would conventionally call AI, but he doesn't believe that AI actually represents anything above and beyond machine learning. With that, I think it's basically that your question is right on, but I think it's partially about money, that people sell things as AI, and they say, we're doing machine learning, this is sexy. And it is, right? It's new stuff. But when it comes to actually deciding what you're doing, the toolkit that you have is the most important thing, right? And so sometimes the AI or machine learning toolkit is actually going to be right, particularly when you're trying to predict something. When you're trying to do a causal inference, like we're trying to do here, did this intervention, did these 20,000 posters change something in people's behavior? Do they have the potential? Do these messages have the potential to change something? You're probably going to go more with a traditional method. So this is something that is sort of a classic distinction. Well, not classic within the last 15 years, but things change quickly nowadays, right? Is between a prediction problem and a causal inference problem. And so if you're thinking about trying to predict something, you're trying to target something, then you probably want to use a machine learning approach if you can get process-driven data, right? So if you can get election results, if you can get a census, if you can get how many people clicked something and who clicked something on the internet on a page, then that's useful. You're not going to be able to, though, use AI and machine learning to exactly measure this. There are AI approaches and machine learning approaches to actually trying to identify electoral fraud, but none of them really are all that effective at identifying the percent of votes that may have been sold. And so it really is sort of my advice to everyone is think about the toolkit. Do you need a hammer? Do you need a screw? What do you need? So that's always what I try and encourage people to think about. What's your research question? What's your problem? How can you solve it? Which tool is best?
Thank you for the research. Maybe I missed something, but I would like to understand how did you differ the behavioral change of vote buying and tendency to tell the truth actually in outcome variable. Yeah. So maybe I missed something.
No. So the outcome variable inside of this is the number of items that someone actually admitted to engaging in. And so one group of people, they see a list of 3 items. One group of people see a second list with 4 items. And so with this analysis, it's an ICT reg. So it's basically looking at what's the difference between the people who see 4 items versus 3 items when the 4th item is always vote buying. And by randomizing who sees which list, on average, we get comparable groups. And so we wouldn't expect there to be any difference between them, except for one saw that one item and one didn't see that one item. And so in that way, that's how we get to the estimate. With item count regressions, which is the next step, we can actually control multivariate regressions using that randomization, basically, instrument. And so when it comes to this, it's an item count regression, or an item count regression a la MA, and I forget who the second co-author was because everyone remembers MA. And yeah, that's the strategy When the data analysis is public, we'll have full replication code in R up on our GitHub. And so please do sort of go up and test it out and tell me what's wrong with it, because that's super helpful always. And we really appreciate when people challenge us on our stats. So thank you.
Normally I would have asked you this in the chat, but I guess why not asking you here? So I have two questions, as always, one technical and one not that technical. On the technical aspect, how do you do to avoid contamination in the clusters when you were doing the, let's say, counter the boat buying element, considering that we are speaking about an image because somebody can take a picture and upload. And the not so technical question is why this for me is the representation of what a counter disinformation operation should be. Why do you think that we are not doing this more oftenly? And are we aware of other organizations picking up on this and saying, okay, we want to do something like this or not? And I would have wished to have been in CRRC before now, so I could have participated, but yeah.
Thank you, Lucas. With that, so the first thing with contamination, on the survey, there's a question, so have you seen this poster? And interviewers showed everyone the poster. And so from that, we can actually make an estimate of what's called treatment on the treated. It's usually done with two-stage least squares regression. And so it's a modified ICT reg with two-stage least squares. In that, you basically isolate the people who are what's called never takers, the people who are never going to see your poster no matter how much work you do, the always takers, the people who are always going to see it, and then through the two-stage least squared regression, you end up with an estimate that adjusts for that. So that's the first question. With regards to why people don't do this more often, I wonder the same. One reason that comes to mind, though, is that the first thing is it's relatively expensive to do this. You need a relatively large sample size to find a decent effect size inside of your treatment. The second problem is that it's relatively new. So the statistical package in R for this, I think, was only developed in 2014, and it was really recent work. Some of it's even more recent, and there's not even that many papers out there that have done this. So it's relatively recent econometrics, I would say, is one thing. It's relatively expensive is another thing. So I do hope more people do this. I would like to do this again, potentially the next time there's an election in Georgia, but I would also be quite happy to test out some of these ideas in other locations as well. So thank you for the question. And sorry for the super technical response. I know he more or less understands me because he's a colleague.
Hi, my name is Aidai, and I'm from Kyrgyzstan. So this is the country that was mentioned several times on the slides. Well, recently we got the elections like 2 weeks ago, and the technique with the survey that you have shared, for me personally, is a new thing that I just learned and heard here. Thanks for that. In regard with this, I have a question, like in how many weeks or even months before the elections do you conduct the first part of the survey? And the second, my question is, while comparing the results of the survey, like before the elections and after the elections, so you need to compare the data, right? Do you gather the same, maybe you mentioned this, but I didn't get the idea. Do you conduct the survey within the same group of people? So you are asking this question because you need to compare the results of the survey, right? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So I probably didn't speak clearly enough, as I want to do, particularly when I get excited. So no, we actually don't need to compare the results before and after the elections. So the first survey, which we did about a month before the elections this year. And we did it a month before the elections so that we could get the data in time to get 20,000 posters printed. Ideally, like, you would want it to be as close to the elections as possible so that you know what messages are resonating with people. But then, so we did a survey after the elections as well, and to change the questions to actually try and get, so did people actually do these things? And so we didn't actually need to compare before and after with this specific research question, because the comparison that's really important for us is whether or not anything we did worked. And so with that, we only need to compare the people in the treatment group to the people in the control group after the elections. It would be really interesting, I think, if you could get that before and after comparison with the same people. The problem I think you would run into is that someone keeps coming to my house and asking me this list of things, and there's this one awkward item on that list, and they've come to my house twice now. Maybe something's happening. So that would be the one issue I can imagine with doing a panel on this, but it's a fun idea in lots of ways. So thank you for that question and getting me thinking about other ideas.
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Dustin.
Thanks, Taylor. Thanks, everybody.